The courtroom, the betrayal, and the hidden truth. The courtroom was already crowded when I stepped through the doors that morning. Conversations echoed against the walls, chairs scraped across the polished floor, and every face seemed focused on the case that was about to begin. I walked in quietly, carrying only a thin folder. My daughter noticed me first. A smug smile spread across her face before she leaned toward the people sitting beside her and spoke loudly enough for nearly everyone to hear. "Dad couldn't even hire a proper attorney," she mocked. "He's probably hoping the judge will feel sorry for him." Her husband chuckled. Several relatives joined in. I heard every word. But I didn't answer. Instead, I calmly walked to the defense table and sat down as though none of it mattered. Years of experience had taught me one valuable lesson. The loudest people in the room usually know the least. The courtroom settled into silence as the judge prepared to begin. Then, just before the hearing started, the heavy doors opened once again. A confident woman in a tailored navy suit entered carrying a leather briefcase. She walked directly toward my table without hesitation. Setting the briefcase down, she addressed the judge respectfully. "My apologies for arriving at the last moment, Your Honor. I am here to represent Mr. Walter Cain." The room froze. My daughter's smile disappeared instantly. Her husband stared at me with disbelief. For the first time that morning, neither of them looked confident. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, you already know how dangerous that mistake can become. Before I tell you what happened inside that courtroom, let me take you back to where everything truly began. Every Sunday, I convinced myself things would finally change. Every Sunday, I was wrong. I would iron my favorite shirt, prepare the cornbread recipe my late wife Maggie had loved for decades, and carry it across the lawn from my guest house to my daughter Diana's enormous home. The walk wasn't long. Emotionally, it felt endless. The dining room looked like something from a luxury magazine. An oversized walnut table dominated the room. Crystal glasses reflected the lights overhead. Fresh flowers decorated the center. Everything looked perfect. Everything except the family sitting around it. Richard, my son-in-law, occupied one end of the table like a king reviewing his kingdom. Diana sat opposite him. Their teenage son Connor usually chose a seat somewhere near the middle. My place was always the same. The far corner. Close enough to attend. Far enough to be forgotten. Dinner conversations revolved around investments, luxury developments, expensive vacations, and business deals worth millions. Richard loved talking about money, especially when everyone else was forced to listen. "Our Austin project is exploding," he announced proudly one evening. "Pre-sales are exceeding every projection." Diana smiled proudly. "I told you people would pay extra for lifestyle," she replied. Richard nodded. "At this rate we'll close one of the biggest commercial deals in Texas." Everyone admired the success. Everyone except me. Not because I was jealous. Because something about Richard's excitement felt rehearsed. Like someone trying too hard to convince himself. My homemade cornbread rested untouched in the middle of the table. No one even reached for it. Connor noticed. He always noticed. "Grandpa," he said with a smile, "are you still coming to my football game this Friday?" Before I could answer, Richard interrupted. "Connor, let your grandfather relax. He doesn't need to spend hours sitting in the stadium." Connor's smile faded. I saw disappointment replace excitement. I wanted to tell him I'd never miss one of his games. Instead, I simply lowered my eyes and continued eating. Looking back now, that silence was my greatest mistake. Not because I was afraid. Because I had become accustomed to surrendering little pieces of myself. One quiet compromise at a time. After dinner, I carried the untouched cornbread back to my guest house. The evening was warm. The neighborhood peaceful. Inside my small kitchen, I placed the dish on the counter and rested my hand on the empty chair where Maggie used to sit. She had been gone 6 years. Yet every room still carried traces of her. Sometimes I caught myself setting out 2 coffee mugs before remembering there was only one person left to drink. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Connor. The disappointment in his eyes reminded me of someone else. Myself. I realized I had spent years accepting disrespect simply because it came from family. 3 days later Richard knocked on my door. He hadn't visited in months. Even before opening it, I knew he wanted something. He stood outside holding an expensive bottle of wine. He smiled far too much. "Thought we could spend a little time together," he said. The wine alone probably cost more than $200. Ironically, everyone knew I wasn't allowed to drink anymore because of my heart condition. Richard remembered that. The bottle wasn't a gift. It was decoration. I invited him inside. He immediately scanned the room. Simple furniture. Small kitchen. Nothing luxurious. Nothing impressive. He sat without waiting to be asked. After exchanging meaningless small talk, he leaned forward. "Walter," he began, "I've got an incredible investment opportunity." I listened quietly. Our Austin development hit a temporary delay with permits. Nothing serious. I just need short-term liquidity until the paperwork clears. He paused dramatically. "I need $800,000. I looked directly into his eyes. He continued quickly. "In 6 months I'll repay you $1.2 million. He expected excitement. Instead I asked one question. "What collateral?" "The guest house." He answered so naturally it sounded rehearsed. "You simply allow a temporary lien against the property." I remained silent. Richard kept talking about guaranteed profits. About family. About trust. About opportunity. Finally, I interrupted. "Richard." He stopped. "My savings exist for 2 reasons. My health. And my peace of mind. This proposal protects neither. So my answer is no." The smile vanished. His face hardened immediately. "You're unbelievable." His voice became colder. "After everything we've done for you?" I met his stare. "I paid for this guest house." His jaw tightened. "You're a selfish old man." He snapped. "You'll die alone holding on to money you can't even spend." He slammed the wine bottle onto my kitchen counter. The force rattled Maggie's ceramic baking dish. For a moment, I thought it would shatter. Then he pointed a finger at me. "You'll regret this." Without another word he stormed outside, slamming the door behind him. The room became silent again. I looked at the untouched wine. Then at Maggie's dish. Then toward the closed door. After more than 3 decades investigating financial crimes, I had learned something important. A merely angry man walks away. A desperate man comes back. And when he returns, he usually brings something much worse. Richard's prediction proved true. Only 3 days after storming out of my guest house, my health reminded me that stress always demands payment. Around 3 o'clock on Friday morning, a crushing pain spread across my chest. It wasn't the sharp pain of a heart attack. I'd experienced enough heart problems to recognize the difference. This was the familiar pressure my cardiologist always warned me about. Stress-induced angina. Still dangerous. Still frightening. I reached for my phone. The emergency contact list Maggie had insisted I keep was still taped inside one of my kitchen cabinets. Family first. Doctors second. Neighbors third. Without hesitation, I called Diana. The phone rang several times before she answered. Her voice sounded irritated more than sleepy. "Dad, I need a favor," I said calmly. "I'm having chest pain. I don't think it's a heart attack, but I'd feel safer if someone could drive me to Methodist Hospital." Silence. Then came a long sigh. "Dad, it's 3 in the morning. I know. I've got people coming over early to plan the charity gala. I won't take long." Another sigh. "If it's serious, Call an ambulance." Before I could answer, she hung up. I stared at the screen for several seconds. She hadn't asked if I was all right. She hadn't asked how bad the pain was. She simply calculated how inconvenient helping me would be. For the first time in my life, I truly understood loneliness. Unable to drive safely, I booked an Uber. The driver introduced himself as Marcus. One glance in the rearview mirror was enough for him to realize something wasn't right. "You okay, sir?" "I've been better." He nodded without asking another question. Instead, he lowered the music and drove carefully through the quiet Houston streets. Sometimes kindness comes from complete strangers while family forgets how. The emergency room admitted me quickly. Doctors ran tests. Medication eased the pressure. Fortunately, my heart hadn't suffered permanent damage. The physician looked directly at me before discharge. "Your heart isn't failing, Mr. Cain. But whatever is causing this stress, it needs to stop." Simple words. Powerful words. Later that morning, while returning home, something caught my attention. As the Uber passed River Oaks Day Spa, I noticed Diana's white Range Rover parked outside. She had claimed she couldn't drive me to the hospital because she was preparing for an important meeting. Instead, she was spending the morning at a luxury spa. I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. I simply accepted another uncomfortable truth. Lies become easier for people who stop feeling guilty. Back inside my guest house, I opened the drawer beneath my desk. For months, I had been collecting information. Small observations, odd conversations, financial records, things that didn't quite make sense. Until that morning, I hadn't allowed myself to connect the dots. Now I did. Richard hadn't visited because he loved family. He needed money. Desperately. And desperate people make dangerous decisions. Monday morning confirmed every suspicion. A courier knocked on my door carrying certified legal documents. I signed electronically and opened the thick envelope. The title froze me for only a second. Petition for Guardianship and Estate Control. The petition requested that the court declare me mentally incapable of handling my own finances. The petitioners, Richard Mercer, and my daughter, Diana. I slowly turned each page. According to the attached psychological evaluation, I supposedly suffered from cognitive decline, poor judgment, memory loss, and paranoia. The report recommended that a legal guardian immediately take control of my money, my property, and every financial decision I made. I read the document twice, then looked at the doctor's signature, Frank Odom. The name meant nothing to me. I'd never met him, never spoken to him, never even heard of him. Yet somehow, he had supposedly evaluated my mental condition. Interesting. Very interesting. That afternoon I walked across the lawn carrying the court papers. Richard and Diana were relaxing beside the swimming pool. They looked peaceful, like people celebrating victory before the game had even started. Diana noticed the envelope first. Her smile faded. Richard stood with a drink in his hand. "Walter," he said pleasantly. "We wanted to explain everything before court." I ignored him. Instead I looked at my daughter. "You signed these." She lowered her eyes. "It's for your own good." "My own good. You need help." Richard stepped closer. "You've become forgetful. You make reckless decisions. We're only trying to protect you." I looked directly at Diana. "I called you from the hospital. You hung up." Richard answered instead. "You chose to go alone." That's exactly the kind of poor judgment we're talking about. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally Diana whispered, "We love you." Those words hurt more than the paperwork. Love doesn't steal someone's independence. Love doesn't convince a court your father is mentally incapable. Love doesn't prepare documents behind someone's back. Richard smiled confidently. I'll see you in court. And, honestly, I don't think you'll be able to afford a decent lawyer. They expected fear. Instead, I simply nodded, then turned around and walked back toward the guest house. Not because I was defeated, because I finally knew exactly what needed to happen next. Inside my bedroom stood an old wooden closet. Behind rows of ordinary jackets hung several suits I hadn't worn for years. I pushed them aside. Hidden behind the clothing, a biometric scanner blinked softly. I placed my palm against the reader. A green light flashed. Heavy locks disengaged. A concealed steel door slowly opened. Neither Diana nor Richard had ever known it existed. Beyond that doorway waited another life. A secure office. 3 computer workstations. Locked filing cabinets. Encrypted communication equipment. Private servers humming quietly against the wall. After my retirement, I had built this room for one purpose: to continue helping investigations when necessary. Nobody knew. Not even family. I sat before the monitors and looked at Maggie's photograph taped beneath the center screen. I should have acted sooner, I whispered. Then I picked up the secure satellite phone. There was only one attorney I trusted: Caroline Webb, the daughter of one of my closest former colleagues. She answered after 2 rings. Webb Legal. This is Walter Cain. Silence. Then surprise. Mr. Cain, I need your help. I briefly explained the conservatorship petition. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. Have you ever met Dr. Frank Odom? Never. Another pause. I'll be in Houston tomorrow morning. The following day, Caroline arrived exactly at 9. Professional, confident, prepared. She entered my hidden office and looked around slowly. So, they really have no idea who you are? I smiled. Not yet. She opened her laptop, examined every page of the petition, then focused on Frank Odom's evaluation. Give me 1 hour. It took her 54 minutes. When she finally looked up, there was excitement in her eyes. Walter, we've already found our first lie. Frank Odom isn't a licensed psychologist. I leaned forward. What is he? A former physical therapist. She continued searching. His medical license was permanently revoked years ago. Fraud. Fake insurance claims. Illegal prescription referrals. And she looked directly at me. He served time in federal prison. I remained silent. Caroline slowly closed her laptop. This evaluation isn't just questionable. It's fraudulent. And if Richard knowingly submitted it, he has a very serious problem. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since everything began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was investigating. And Richard Mercer had no idea what he had just started. Caroline sat back in her chair after revealing Frank Odom's past, allowing the weight of the discovery to settle over the room. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The steady hum of the servers was the only sound inside the hidden office. Finally, I broke the silence. Tell me everything. She reopened her laptop and began laying out the timeline. Frank Odom wasn't just stripped of his license, she explained. He lost it after investigators uncovered a Medicare fraud operation. He billed for treatments that never happened, falsified patient records, and participated in an illegal prescription referral scheme. After pleading guilty, he served time in federal prison. She looked directly at me. Someone like him doesn't suddenly become a licensed mental health expert. I nodded slowly. So Richard found a convicted fraudster. and used him to convince a judge that I'm mentally incompetent. Caroline's expression remained calm. I think it's even worse than that. She turned the screen toward me. I traced Odom's financial history after prison. A corporate filing appeared. One name immediately caught my attention. Mercer Property Holdings. Richard's company. He posted Odom's bond 7 years ago, Caroline said quietly. I stared at the screen. So they've known each other for years. She nodded. This wasn't a last-minute decision. He kept Odom available, waiting until he needed him. The realization settled heavily inside me. Richard hadn't panicked after I refused the loan. He had simply activated a backup plan he'd prepared long before. While Caroline continued researching Odom, I shifted my attention to Richard's business empire. Old habits returned naturally. For over 3 decades, I had investigated financial fraud. Numbers often revealed truths that people worked desperately to hide. I started with public corporate filings, then county property records, then financing statements. Piece by piece, a completely different picture emerged. The Austin Tower Richard bragged about every Sunday wasn't thriving. It was collapsing. Construction costs had exploded far beyond budget. Contractors hadn't been paid. Liens were piling up against the project. Cash reserves were nearly gone. Richard hadn't been exaggerating his success. He had been hiding his failure. I called Caroline over. Look at this. She studied the documents carefully. Her eyebrows slowly rose. 22 contractor liens. She shook her head. That's catastrophic. I opened another financial report. The primary lender issued an emergency capital demand. $8 million. Her eyes widened. That's why he needed your money. Exactly. He wasn't asking me to invest. He was trying to keep his entire business from collapsing. Caroline continued tracing financial connections. Then another discovery appeared. Walter. She turned her laptop. Something else doesn't make sense. Richard couldn't possibly afford this legal attack. What do you mean? The attorneys. The fake evaluation. Court filings. Private investigators. This operation costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. She folded her arms. But according to these records, he doesn't have that kind of cash. The room became quiet. Then a thought crossed my mind. There was only one account containing enough money. One account Richard couldn't legally touch. Unless. I immediately picked up the satellite phone. Who are you calling? Caroline asked. The private bank that manages Maggie's charitable foundation. The banker answered after only a few rings. Mr. Cain. I need every transaction made from the Maggie Cain Foundation over the last 12 months. There was a brief pause. Immediately, within minutes, the encrypted report arrived. I opened it. The first number caught my attention. The foundation should have contained nearly $4 million. Instead, less than $600,000 remained. I stared at the screen. No. I whispered. Then I began reading each transaction. Small scholarship payments. Community grants. Normal activity. Then, everything changed. One payment. $210,000. Recipient. Mercer Development Group. Another payment. $130,000. Recipient. Houston Premier Events. I searched the company. It belonged to Richard. My stomach tightened. They hadn't borrowed from Maggie's foundation. They had stolen from it. Money intended for struggling students had been diverted into Richard's failing companies. The scanned checks appeared on my monitor. Every signature belonged to Diana. Not forged. Not forced. Signed willingly. The room suddenly felt much smaller. For years I'd tried convincing myself Richard had manipulated her, that she simply trusted the wrong man. Those excuses disappeared with a single signature. She knew exactly what she was doing. I walked outside. The evening air felt unusually heavy. For a long time I simply stood there, looking toward the sky, thinking about Maggie, thinking about every student she'd helped during 30 years as a teacher. The foundation had been created to continue her kindness after she was gone. Instead, it had become Richard's emergency bank account. My daughter had allowed it, perhaps even suggested it. When I finally returned inside, Caroline looked at me carefully. "You found something." I nodded. "They stole $340,000. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "Don't be. We're finished defending ourselves." I looked directly at her. "From this moment forward, we're going on offense." She slowly smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." She opened a fresh legal file. "What comes first? We expose every lie, every stolen dollar, every fraudulent document. And when this reaches the courtroom, I want the truth so overwhelming that no one in that room will ever question what really happened." Caroline nodded confidently. "Then let's finish building the case." The Harris County Courthouse buzzed with quiet conversations as people filtered into the courtroom. Lawyers shuffled files, spectators whispered, and reporters waited along the back wall. Richard Mercer sat confidently beside Diana, convinced the hearing would end within an hour. Walter entered without rushing. His dark navy suit fit perfectly despite the years since he'd last worn it. He carried no visible briefcase, no stack of papers, only the calm confidence of someone who had already prepared for every possible outcome. Richard leaned toward Diana with a grin. "Looks like he came alone." Before she could answer, the courtroom doors opened. A woman in a charcoal suit walked straight toward Walter. "Your Honor," she said. Caroline Webb, appearing on behalf of Mr. Walter Cain. Richard's smile disappeared. The judge acknowledged her appearance and invited both parties forward. Richard's attorney spoke first. He painted Walter as an aging widower who could no longer safely manage his affairs. He described forgotten appointments, declining judgment, and alleged financial confusion. Finally, he presented Dr. Frank Odom's psychological evaluation. "Our expert concludes that Mr. Cain lacks the capacity to make sound financial decisions." The judge turned toward Caroline. "Counsel." Caroline stood slowly. "Your Honor, before discussing my client's mental capacity, I would like to examine the credibility of the petitioner's expert." She placed several certified documents on the evidence table. "Dr. Frank Odom is not a licensed psychologist." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Richard shifted in his chair. Caroline continued. "He has never held a psychology license in Texas." She displayed another document. "He is a former physical therapist whose professional license was permanently revoked after convictions involving insurance fraud and illegal prescription referrals." Richard's attorney quickly stood. "Objection. These accusations are irrelevant." Caroline calmly replied. "They are highly relevant because this individual claims to have performed a psychological evaluation he was never legally qualified to conduct." The judge examined the records carefully. The objection was overruled. For the first time that morning, Richard looked uneasy. Caroline wasn't finished. She introduced certified state licensing records, federal court documents, prison release records. Every page confirmed the same fact. Frank Odom had never been legally authorized to diagnose cognitive impairment. The courtroom grew silent. The judge slowly removed his glasses. "Counsel," he asked Richard's attorney, "were you aware of these licensing issues before filing this petition?" The attorney hesitated. "I relied upon the expert's representations." Caroline stepped forward again. Unfortunately, Your Honor, the petitioners did much more than rely upon him. She displayed another exhibit. A corporate guarantee filed years earlier. Mercer Property Holdings. Richard's company. The document showed Richard personally guaranteed Frank Odom's bond after his criminal charges. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Richard's face lost all color. So, Caroline continued, this wasn't an independent medical opinion. It was provided by a man with long-standing financial ties to the petitioner's family. The judge leaned back slowly. His expression had changed completely. Walter remained silent. He simply watched. For 31 years he had learned that facts speak louder than anger. Caroline introduced another series of exhibits. Public financial records. Contractor liens. Loan defaults. Construction delays. Richard's celebrated Austin skyscraper wasn't thriving. It was collapsing. 22 unpaid contractors had already filed legal claims. Millions of dollars had disappeared. The private lender had demanded immediate repayment. Richard's attorney objected again. This has nothing to do with conservatorship. Caroline smiled politely. It has everything to do with motive. She walked toward the judge. The petitioners claimed Mr. Cain was financially incompetent. In reality, they desperately needed access to his assets. Every sentence weakened Richard's position. Then came the moment no one expected. Caroline produced bank records from the Maggie Cain Foundation. The judge carefully reviewed the documents. Scholarship funds. Charitable donations. Then, transfers totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. Recipient. Mercer Development Group. Another payment. Recipient. Houston Premier Events. Both businesses were controlled by Richard Mercer. Caroline spoke clearly. The foundation was created to help underprivileged students attend college. Instead, the money financed Richard Mercer's failing companies. She placed enlarged copies of 2 canceled checks before the court. The signature at the bottom belonged to Diana. Walter looked toward his daughter. She refused to meet his eyes. The courtroom became completely silent. Richard finally stood. This is being taken out of context. Caroline answered immediately. Excellent. Please explain the context. He couldn't. Because there wasn't one. The judge slowly closed the folder. Then looked directly at Richard. Mr. Mercer, I strongly advise you to stop speaking until you've consulted with your attorney. Richard sat down. His confidence had completely vanished. Across the room, several family members who had supported Diana began whispering among themselves. Some stared at Walter with disbelief. Others simply looked embarrassed. They had entered believing Walter was a confused old man. Now, they were watching one of the most carefully prepared legal cases any of them had ever seen. The courtroom had grown so quiet that every page turning sounded louder than normal. Richard sat motionless. The confident businessman who had entered the courthouse that morning had disappeared. Sweat formed along his forehead as he watched Caroline organize one final stack of documents. Walter remained calm. His expression never changed. He wasn't enjoying Richard's downfall. He was waiting for the truth to finish speaking. Caroline approached the bench once more. Your Honor, she began, everything we've presented today establishes motive, financial fraud, and a deliberate attempt to seize my client's assets. However, the evidence doesn't end there. She nodded toward the courtroom clerk. A large monitor flickered to life. The first image appeared. It was security footage from Walter's guest house. Richard immediately recognized it. His face turned pale. The recording showed him entering Walter's home with the expensive bottle of wine only days before the conservatorship petition had been filed. The audio played clearly. Everyone heard Richard asking Walter for an $800,000 investment. Then came Walter's calm refusal. Moments later, Richard's voice changed. "You'll regret this." The recording ended. No one spoke. The judge looked directly at Richard. "So this petition was filed less than a week after your request for financial assistance was denied?" Richard swallowed hard. It wasn't connected. Caroline didn't argue. Instead, she played another clip. This one came from the home's exterior camera. Richard was pacing outside after leaving Walter's house. He pulled out his phone. Seconds later, the recording captured only one sentence. "If he won't sign willingly, we'll make sure someone else signs for him." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Richard's attorney buried his face in his hands. Even he hadn't known that recording existed. Caroline waited until the room became quiet again. "Your Honor, intent has now been established." She walked toward the evidence table. "But there is still one important question. Who helped Mr. Mercer?" Everyone looked toward Diana. She slowly lowered her head. Walter couldn't stop looking at his daughter. He wanted, just once, for her to deny everything. To say she'd been manipulated. To explain that she'd been pressured. Instead, she remained silent. Caroline displayed another exhibit. A chain of emails recovered through a court-approved forensic examination. The first message came from Richard. "If your father refuses again, we'll move ahead with guardianship." The second reply came only 8 minutes later. It was from Diana. "He's stubborn. Once the court signs the order, we can refinance everything before he realizes what's happening." Walter closed his eyes. Those words hurt more than every insult Richard had ever spoken. This wasn't manipulation. It was planning. His own daughter had helped design the scheme. Richard suddenly stood. "This is illegal. You hacked our emails." Caroline remained composed. The records were obtained through lawful discovery after this court approved the request. Richard turned toward his attorney. "You told me they'd never get those." The attorney stared at him in disbelief. "I told you not to send them." The courtroom became silent once again. Richard realized what he had just admitted. His own words confirmed everything. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Mercer, please sit down." Richard slowly obeyed. His confidence was gone. His carefully constructed image had completely collapsed. Just when everyone believed the hearing was over, the courtroom doors opened. A young man stepped inside. Connor. He looked nervous. His school backpack still rested over one shoulder. Walter smiled faintly. He hadn't expected his grandson to come. Connor walked carefully toward the witness stand. "I'd like to say something." Richard immediately objected. "He's a child." The judge looked toward Caroline. She nodded. "The testimony concerns facts directly related to this case." The judge allowed it. Connor took a deep breath. "I wasn't supposed to hear them. My parents thought I was upstairs. But I heard everything." He looked at Walter. "My grandfather isn't confused. He remembers everything. He's the smartest person I know." Connor's voice shook. "I heard my dad tell Mom that Grandpa's money would save the company. He said once the court gave them control, they'd sell the guest house and transfer Grandpa into a nursing facility." Walter felt his heart sink. Connor continued. "My mom cried. But she finally agreed." Tears filled Diana's eyes. Connor looked toward her. "I kept waiting for you to stop him. You never did." The room became completely silent. Several jurors wiped away tears. Even court staff struggled to hide their emotions. Walter realized something in that moment. Connor hadn't come to save him. He had come to save himself. He refused to spend the rest of his life pretending he hadn't known the truth. Caroline stood one final time. "Your Honor." My client came into this courtroom accused of being mentally incompetent. Instead, we discovered financial fraud, forged professional credentials, charitable theft, conspiracy, and an organized attempt to steal the assets of an elderly man. She slowly closed her folder. The evidence speaks for itself. The judge nodded. I agree. He removed his glasses, looked toward Richard, then Diana, then Walter. I will recess for 30 minutes before issuing my ruling. The gavel struck. No one moved. Everyone understood that when the judge returned, nothing in the Mercer family would ever be the same. 30 minutes felt like an eternity. No one left the courtroom. The whispers that had filled the room earlier had disappeared, replaced by complete silence. Richard sat motionless, staring at the polished wooden floor. His attorney quietly reviewed documents, but neither of them believed there was much left to argue. Diana remained frozen in her chair. She had cried throughout the recess, yet no amount of tears could erase the emails, bank records, or testimony the court had already seen. Walter sat beside Caroline without saying a word. He wasn't thinking about winning. He was thinking about Maggie. She had always believed that truth eventually found its way into the light. Today, she had been right. The courtroom doors opened. All rise. Everyone stood as Judge Eleanor Watkins returned to the bench. She carefully placed a thick folder before her and looked across the courtroom. I have reviewed the testimony, the documentary evidence, and the legal arguments presented by both parties. She paused. This court finds the petition for conservatorship entirely without merit. Richard slowly lowered his head. The evidence establishes that the petition was supported by a fraudulent psychological evaluation prepared by an individual with no legal authority to conduct such an examination. She turned another page. Furthermore, substantial evidence demonstrates that the petitioners had a significant financial motive for seeking control of Mr. Walter Cain's assets. The judge looked directly at Richard. The court therefore dismisses this petition with prejudice. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. But the judge wasn't finished. I am also referring today's evidence to the Texas Attorney General's office, the Harris County District Attorney, and the Texas State Securities Board for investigation into possible fraud, financial exploitation of an elderly person, charitable fund misuse, conspiracy, and perjury. Richard's face turned completely white. His attorney closed his notebook. He understood what those words meant. This case wasn't ending. It was only beginning. The judge turned toward Walter. Mr. Cain. Walter stood respectfully. I have reviewed your financial records and professional history. There is absolutely no evidence suggesting cognitive impairment. In fact, she smiled faintly. Your record demonstrates exceptional financial competence. A few people quietly laughed. You have successfully managed complex investments, charitable organizations, and personal assets for decades. The judge nodded. It appears your judgment has protected you from exactly the type of exploitation this court exists to prevent. Walter simply answered, Thank you, Your Honor. Then the judge faced Richard and Diana. I want both of you to understand something. Elder financial abuse is among the fastest-growing crimes in this country. It often begins with manipulation. It frequently ends with isolation. And sometimes, it is committed by family members. The courtroom became silent again. The betrayal of trust demonstrated here is deeply troubling. Richard looked as though he wanted to respond. His attorney gently placed a hand on his arm. Don't. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Microphones surrounded Richard before he reached the sidewalk. Mr. Mercer, did you steal money from the charity? Is your company under investigation? Did you knowingly submit false medical records? Richard pushed through the crowd without answering. Cameras followed him all the way to his car. Across the street, another group gathered around Walter. One reporter asked quietly, "Mr. Cain, after everything that's happened, how do you feel?" Walter thought for a moment. "I don't feel victorious. I feel grateful." The reporter looked confused. Walter continued, "I'm grateful the truth arrived before it was too late." Within days, the consequences began. Banks suspended Richard's corporate credit lines. Several investors withdrew from his remaining developments. Contractors filed additional lawsuits. State investigators froze several business accounts connected to the charity transfers. Employees who had once admired Richard quietly updated their resumes. His carefully built reputation collapsed faster than any building he had ever constructed. Diana moved out of the family home 2 weeks later. She requested several meetings with Walter. At first, he declined. Not because he hated her. Because forgiveness requires honesty before reconciliation. One afternoon she appeared at the guest house carrying a small cardboard box. Walter invited her inside. She placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside were old family photographs, Connor's childhood drawings, Maggie's wedding ring, and a handwritten letter. "I found this while cleaning the house," Diana whispered. "It was Mom's." Walter carefully unfolded the faded paper. Maggie's handwriting looked exactly as he remembered. "Walter, if you're reading this one day without me, promise me something. Don't let anger become the last chapter of our family's story. People fail. Sometimes they fail terribly. But if someone truly changes, leave the door unlocked long enough for them to find their way home." Walter quietly folded the letter. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally Diana broke the silence. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to know. I'm ashamed of what I became." Walter looked into her eyes. For the first time in years, he believed she meant every word. "I can't erase what happened," he said. "And neither can you. But what you do tomorrow still belongs to you." Tears rolled down Diana's face. She hugged her father. Walter hugged her back. Not because everything was fixed. Because healing always begins with one honest moment. Connor visited every Friday after school. They rebuilt the old wooden workbench behind the guest house together. Walter taught him how to repair furniture, how to balance a budget, how to recognize dishonest deals before signing contracts. But most importantly, he taught him something money could never buy. "Character," Walter often said, "isn't revealed when life is easy. It's revealed when doing the right thing costs you something." Connor never forgot those words. 1 year later, the Maggie Cain Foundation reopened with a new board of directors and stricter financial oversight. Its first scholarship ceremony filled the local community center. Students from families who had never imagined college was possible stood proudly beside their parents. Walter handed each recipient a scholarship certificate. Behind him hung a simple photograph of Maggie smiling warmly. Below it were the words she had lived by. "Kindness is the only investment that never loses value." As the applause echoed through the hall, Walter looked toward the front row. Connor smiled proudly. Diana quietly wiped away another tear. She had spent the past year volunteering for the foundation without accepting a single dollar. She knew rebuilding trust would take years. She was willing to spend those years earning it. Walter smiled. Not because life had become perfect, because it had become honest. And after everything they had endured, that was enough.